We have Ali Brown, Mike Snowdon, Ben Parry, and Michal Piatek.
Hi, everyone. So today we're going to be talking about space. But before we do, I'm going to kick things off with a quick trailer to show you what's to come. Cool. So I'm Ali Brown, Director of Graphics Engineering. I'm responsible for all of the graphics programmers in the company and all the visual technology. We've got Ben Parry, Senior Graphics Programmer, who does all the cool stuff that I wish I had time to do. Mike Snowdon, our Director of VFX, sorry. And Michal, the Senior VFX Artist. So today we're going to talk about how we go about developing the technology and workflows to create the space environments. And we've been working on this for quite a while, and we wanted to improve our space. So as you all know, it's a space game. Space, in reality, it can be pretty boring. That's an actual NASA photo of Earth with not a lot between us and the moon. So that's real and all, but that's not what we want in our game, clearly, or not all the time. So here's Orion Nebula, actual photo from NASA. But this looks awesome. It looks great. It's the type of thing you might expect in a sci-fi film or game. But this isn't real, really. This has been brightened significantly from the NASA photo. And they've also used false colors where red, green, and blue are used to represent different elements. It doesn't look like this with the naked eye. It's also 24 light years across, and 1 billion times less dense than a laboratory vacuum chamber. So actually, if you were in this, it would be imperceivable to you, and it just really wouldn't be that fun to fly around. But nonetheless, we still have this perception. We want something like this. We want something visual to fly around in space. So that's what we wanted to explore as part of this R&D process. So here's some very early prototypes of a type of gas clouds, vaguely similar to that nebula. And our talented art team tried a bunch of different type of looks and styles of what type of shapes we could have in space. I'll just let these play out for a little bit. So these were developed in proprietary type of, type of volumetric rendering technology called FumeFX and Houdini. And these are using our gas cloud rendering system, which we've been developing for some time, and Ben will talk about a bit later on. And they look great. They're really interesting. But again, they have this type of fundamental problem of scale, where if you look at this, you might imagine that might be 100 miles or 1,000 miles, something like that wide. And if it's that type of scale, the scale of a moon or a planet, if you're flying through it, then there's really not going to be anything there. It's going to be like just in the middle of a cloud when you're in a plane. There's just nothing really interesting to explore at the type of conventional spaceship speed. So to demonstrate that, here's a QTing into a gas cloud. This gas cloud is about 300 kilometers wide. And while you QT, it looks great. But once you stop, there's nothing really moving other than these nearby asteroids. So again, it's a good backdrop. It's interesting, but it's not giving us that gameplay we quite wanted. So we plan to overcome this problem in 2 different ways. The first is planetary rings, which is similar to this, which is Saturn's rings. So these are huge, obviously, but however, they're extremely thin in reality. So Saturn's rings are only about 10 meters high on average. The widest point is a couple of kilometers. So that's nice. That's the type of the scale that a spaceship can fly around, dodge between asteroids like you'd expect in a film. Yet they stretch for hundreds of thousands of miles. So Saturn is 120,000 kilometers wide, and obviously the rings extend much further than that. So that's type of an interesting play space for us. And obviously we have some simple asteroid rings in the game at the moment, but that's something we definitely want to expand on. And because they're effectively 2D, they're relatively simple to author, and they give us a very easy mechanism of getting a good, interesting play space. However, that's not something we're going to focus on for the moment. One more thing. So this is an artistic type of concept image for the type of thing that we might do for a planetary ring, just to add a little bit more interest. So obviously it looks pretty cool, and you can imagine flying through this in these little Drake down there. this is something we're really interested to develop, but we're going to be looking at this next year. This year, what we wanted to look at is something a bit more volumetric. So one of the problems with this is, although it looks great and it'll be fun to traverse, it's because of it's effectively 2D, you can just fly anywhere straight away. There's nothing that's hidden. There's no type of journey within this. Once you're in the asteroid, once you're outside of it, you can just fly to any point and then just dive in. So it gives us something, but the designers were asking for something more, something where you could have like a journey, like a 20-minute adventure into some type of structure. So we started looking at more of a volumetric approach, and what we wanted to do was build networks of tunnels and chambers that are contained within a gas cloud. So like we had earlier, we saw them type of pretty nebula-looking things. We wanted to have something that looked like that from the outside, but inside we got something more like this, some of those like clouds, and we can dodge between things at like conventional speeds. So over about the last 2 or 3 months, we've had the graphics team, VFX team, and art team all coordinating together to make a prototype, which is going to showcase how we want to make future space environments. So I showed you a brief clip at the start. At the end of the presentation, we'll show you the full prototype. But first, we'll type of break down the technology and the workflows that go into it, and then save the good stuff for the end. So yeah, building volumetric data turns out to be really hard. But luckily, the film industry has solved this for us pretty much. There's lots of really great software out there that they use in the films. I mentioned before Houdini and Fume Effects. This is Houdini, I think. And they have really powerful tools so you can combine fluid simulations and multiple layers of noise to get these really interesting shapes. And it's exactly what they would do in film. So we take that data and we export it into a format called OpenVDB, which is something that was developed by the film industry, by DreamWorks Animations, for films such as Puss in Boots and a bunch of other ones. And now, once we export it into that, that's type of what we take into the engine directly, and then start convert it into our own format, and then we attempt to render that directly, which is something games don't typically type of take on that type of volumetric data. So that was the challenge for us. So, yeah, so we, as I mentioned, we generated offline tools, use fluid simulation, layers of noise. But one of the main problems with that is the amount of memory it takes for this volumetric data is pretty huge. So we have to put a lot of effort into optimizing that and crushing the data as small as we can get it. But it's still quite high. So to try and combat that, we're making modular pieces. So we're going to make say, 30, 40-kilometer long sections, and we're going to piece them together, which is similar to what the environment team do when they're building a space station or any other outpost or something like that. And we're going to type of position a few of these together to build longer, more elaborate missions and areas. And we'll also have bespoke, chunks, bespoke pieces when we want to do something a bit more interesting, especially, say, when it came to Squadron 42. Yeah. And then, to avoid you ever recognizing these things were actually sometimes reused, we're putting a lot of effort into how we light these things and the visual effects. Now, it's surprising how much difference you can really get by just relighting the same area of volumetric data differently. It's almost unrecognizable. And because there is no horizon, it's very easy to get disorientated. So it's not easy to recognize it. So we feel like we've hit a good balance between the memory cost, how quickly it is to author, because obviously the more we can reuse things, the more content we can make. But we'll talk more about the lighting and VFX later. But for now, I'm going to hand you over to Ben to tell you how the hell we get this thing in-game and actually render it at a sensible frame rate.
Hi there. So I'm just going to quickly run through sort of what makes a volume like this different from rendering normal objects and some of the challenges that we had to deal with and overcome, I guess, hopefully. Right, so this volume is a single object. It's about 30 kilometers long, so that's quite a lot bigger than your average object in the game. Also, unlike most of the other objects in the game, you're inside it most of the time. So to explain, hang on. These are the voxels. So they're basically volumetric pixels. And as you can see, there's millions of them. So yeah, after 5,000 hours in MS Paint, this is a diagram of what it looks like roughly. So, so ignoring the cloud for a minute, we've got 3 asteroids on screen here. And what the engine can usually do for us is we can pass objects to the 3D engine, and it's got some very efficient methods that it can sort of speed things up by reducing what we have to deal with on the rendering side. So if you look at the asteroid on the left, for instance, that's outside the player's view frustum, so we never hear about that for that frame. Also, the one on the right, that's occluded by the bigger one, so again, that just never has to be dealt with. And then the big one, we know how far away from the player it is, so at least we can pick a level of detail for it, and we can do stuff like that, I guess. Now, the gas cloud has a bit of a problem, because it's occluded, it's disoccluded, it's 0 distance from the player, it's 30 kilometers from the player. If the rendering code gets hold of this, it's going to have to make loads and loads of work to try and process all of it, process half of it. So the solution we came up with is that we literally never tell the rendering engine or the 3D engine about this object. What we tell it about instead is a huge number of placeholder objects that we've excitingly called chunks. The volumetric data is just chopped up, stuck in a big memory bucket somewhere else. And the chunks just know where they are in space, and they know where the data is. So you can treat them basically as game objects. And back to another 5,000 hours in MS Paint. You can see the chunks in the middle in the empty space. We just didn't generate any because there wasn't any gas there, so there's no point processing them. The chunks that are far away from the player, we've actually got a hierarchy of chunks. So the small ones are contained within larger ones, and if they're far away, we just use the large one instead of the small one. So that sort of limits how many of them we have to process. And then when the 3D engine gets to it to cull it, you can see quite a lot of them aren't needed anymore. So that lets the CPU do a lot of work in advance, and then the GPU can just focus on receiving a list of chunks that have already been vetted and then just drawing them. So how do we draw a chunk? So the whole thing's semi-transparent. So it's unlike a normal object that's like some polygons. You draw the polygon in place, the job's done. You kind of need to accumulate all of the stuff that you can see through. So we're going to use ray marching for that. What that means is for every pixel that we draw, such as the middle one, we just draw a line from the start through the chunk to wherever it exits, or in the second chunk, it would just start at an entry point and go to an exit point. We'd just chop that up into a bunch of steps, and then we just process each step in turn, and we find out how much color's in one place. We mask it out by however much opacity has already been accumulated on the previous steps, and we just sort of build up a final image. So if we work through all of these with the artist's data that we've been given, we get this screenshot. So the artist's data doesn't actually contain any lights, so everything is in fact the same color. So moving on, let's talk about lights. What have I got? Oh yeah. So just focusing on this one point that we're dealing with for a moment, we need to know a few things to be able to work out how much light there is for that section. So the first thing we need to know is how much gas is there at that point. That's easy enough to get. The next thing we need to know is how much light gets to that gas. So that's easy enough to do. We know how far away it is. We can make it fall off. Then finally, there's a phase function that just tells us if that light reaches the gas, how much of it actually comes towards the camera. And that's a fairly simple function. It just says if a light ray hits something, then a lot of it tends to go through in the direction it was going. A very small amount of it goes back the other way, and you get something in between. So here's an example of that phase function in action. This is just the same test volume viewed from two different angles. And so as you can see, on the one on the right, the sort of bright halo that it has around the edges, that's the phase function letting more of it through towards the player. So what was I going to say now? Yeah, so we've got all that work that we have to do for a point. And then if you multiply that by hundreds of samples and multiple lights per frame, what you end up with is very, very low frame rate. And what's annoying about that is that 2 pixels next to each other, 2 pixels next to each other are basically getting the same result. So it's kind of pointless to be doing all that extra work. So the way we deal with that is we just break that into 2 separate calculations. At the start of the frame, we know how many chunks there are, and we've got distances and all that kind of useful knowledge. So we can estimate how much detail it's going to need in the lighting, and it just has to kind of calculate at some resolution, usually a resolution lower than the actual gas cloud density, how much light it needs in each chunk. So we just do that work once, And then the ray march can just pass through it. It just has to get the density, get the lighting, multiply them together, move to the next step. So that just speeds the whole process up. So yeah, that gives us this. So you can see a lot more than the previous screenshot, at least. It's kind of flat, though. You can't really see the shape that you're looking at. So the problem here is that there's actually no shadows in that calculation that we've done. So we're going to move on to shadows. So how do you work out how much shadow there is between the light and that point? So the problem with standard shadows that you use in a game is they usually store just a single depth value for an opaque object. That's usually enough. Anything in front of that depth must be out of shadow. Anything behind it's in shadow. And the problem we've got with this is obviously you could be in 50% shadow, you could be in 80% shadow or whatever. So we need something that we can calculate when the light's created that just tells us how much. You can immediately just ask it for any point, how much shadow is there at this point? So obviously, the thing to do is we slice the light up into a load of little chunks. We ray march all of those at the start of the at creation, and then the GPU crashes. Yeah, we decided not to do that. Now, to be honest, yeah, we could actually split that work over 10, 100 frames or something. It would still cost a lot of memory, and it would also give us issues that, suppose you want a lightning strike that hits a ship as it's flying somewhere. You'd have to ask the gameplay code, where is that ship going to be in 100 frames time, because I'd like to start creating a light for it. And even then, there's just this huge piece of background work that it's constantly having to work on. So we thought, what if there was something we could be doing in 2D? Can we get away with something that just works in 2D? And what's nice about doing clouds is that if you look at, this is just a graph of how much density there is along that blue line. It's quite a low frequency kind of undulating shape. And so thinking about frequencies is actually a really good answer. So we switched to a technique that's called Fourier shadows. So this is going to be incomprehensible, this diagram probably. But basically, instead of storing a value for every single step along the ray, it stores how much would you multiply a whole bunch of sine and cosine waves by if you wanted to just sort of try and get that value. And then if you do that for every single step along the ray, you end up with a curve that kind of approximates the original shape. Depending on how many you put in, you get closer to the original shape. So with one weight, what you basically get is just the average value. So that's not so great. If you add one sine and cosine, you end up with something that's still not great. But as you build them up, you slowly get something that is sort of like the right shape curve. Now, we actually did stop at 7 weights because just in terms of the amount of memory and the amount of processing that we're trying to trade off, we found that was actually enough to get us from this view to this view, which we think is, is decent. Let's go back to that, and back to that. Right, so yeah, that actually now runs fast enough. We are still optimizing it a little, but it does run fast enough that you can now have a lightning strike that just pops up on that frame. We have to spend like a millisecond or something. I don't know how long it takes, but yeah, you can create them on the fly so long as you don't create like 50 of them in the same frame. The downside is it's still not quite the screenshot we started with. It's kind of monochrome. I think that's only 2 lights, but yeah, they're the same color, so it's kind of monochrome. So we needed something that doesn't introduce a whole load more processing, a whole load more data, but we wanted to sort of enrich it and give you more of a sort of 3D sense of the scene. So a really inexpensive thing to do is you just take this, you multiply all of those values by just completely artist-controlled sliders. So you can then just apply these color. You get kind of a color fringe on the edge of a dark area where, like in this case, the red won't have actually been as shadowed as the green just because we multiplied it down. So yeah, that is what takes you from this to this. Yeah, so this is still not as good as that trailer that we showed you. But the thing is, this is actually as much as I can helpfully do. So I'm just going to hand the baton over to the VFX team with Mike and Michal, and they can carry us the rest of the way.
OK. So this is how the gas cloud looked. Fantastic stuff that Ben just showed there. And we were obviously really happy with the lighting, the visual fidelity, and the technical achievement of this thing. But inevitably, after showing it to art and design, and Ali alluded to this earlier, there are several issues that we're still going to need to solve. So the gas clouds are actually, because they're so big, you're tiny compared to this thing, they actually can be quite frustrating rather than fun to traverse because they feel so empty. And it's also really easy to lose your bearings. You don't really get any kind of visual read of the speed that you're going at. And because it's so empty, it doesn't really feel dangerous, and that's a really important thing that design and art really want to be able to kind of achieve. So typically, in a more standard environment, this is the kind of thing that we'd be able to solve with VFX. So in this slide, I'm showing basically an empty scene. It's just a block out. There's nothing really in there. And I'm just layering it up with different types of effects. So we've got lightning, and then we're bringing in volumetric fog. On top of the fog, there's going to be extra particles. I'll even bring some more in. GPU, screen space collision, get some cool noise, get some gravity, et cetera, and we'll even throw in some screen effects as well. So these are all the kinds of things, like I say, this is kind of a typical thing that we do, and if we can make that look great, it's a simple block out, then we surely should be able to do that with a gas cloud as well. So that's our goal. But how do we do that? And to explain a little bit about how we do that for something that's not quite as conventional, Michal's going to come and show us some stuff.
Hello. OK, so we've seen that level. And now comes time to actually add some VFX to the gas cloud. But conceptually, gas cloud is kind of like a level, but doesn't have any walls, doesn't have any ceiling, and there is also no concept of up and down. So it's kind of mind-boggling how you kind of organize the space. It doesn't have any geometries to start with, so we cannot really attach VFX to anything specific. And also, there is nothing acting as a visual guide. So it's kind of like a level, but it's far less conventional. So let's take a look at the design feedback that we've been given. It's too easy to lose your sense of direction, speed, and distance. Ideally, what we could do is introduce like a flow of air that moves through the gas cloud. And we would have some particles moving through that flow of air. So if you stop, you look around, you can observe the direction of motion and find your way through the tunnel. And that could also add the motion that was missing in the example you've seen before. Next step is making the gas cloud look more dangerous. And it's kind of easy, but not really, because the example we've seen didn't have any distraction elements to it. So we can add them, like debris, rocks smashing into other objects and stuff like that. But also design wanted to define danger levels. So they wanted some areas which are kind of calm. Others should be more dangerous. So you kind of want to escape from these areas faster. So how we go about doing that? Let's take a look at the first problem first. The new GPU particle system, if anyone been to the second stage before, I mentioned that it allows us to use so-called vector fields. Essentially, vector fields are snapshots of wind. So a vector field is a texture, a 3D texture, and each pixel of that texture is a vector in a specific direction. Then, if a particle flows through the vector field, we can sample that vector and push the particle towards that direction. So essentially, a vector field is like a snapshot of a wind. So here in Houdini, we can bring the actual gas cloud data. We can turn all the gas cloud into a mesh, use the Houdini's built-in particle system, flow all of them through the tunnel. Then we can save all that data and use in the engine to actually achieve that sense of motion. But vector fields are only about motion and direction. And there's still the danger problem that we have. So for that, we figured we need lightning and so-called electromagnetic interference. Oops. PowerPoint is not that easy. OK. So here we have the electromagnetic interference. Its minimum strength and maximum strength. Basically, it's a shader effect, and the way it's made, it allows us to do that kind of distortion on any type of screen in the game. So the idea here was to have more interference the closer you are to more dense areas of the gas cloud. Now it plays properly. OK, so same effect applied to mobiGlas without much effort, really. Again, the way that the effect was made. But the problem is, with this effect, that the first version of it was driven by the density of gas cloud. So you get more dense areas and less dense areas. And basically, we wanted to make denser areas more dangerous. So what we did is that we are sampling density of the gas cloud at player's location. The problem with that was showing you that you are in the danger area, and that's not quite useful. Design wanted to inform you that you're about to enter the dense area. And also sampling the gas cloud density is not very efficient. So we had to come up with another solution. And for that, we use so-called sign distance fields. So the problem is that the gas cloud on its own doesn't have any walls. It doesn't have distance to anything. Ideally, what we would do is we would sample density of the gas cloud from all around you. Then we would kind of figure out if you're close enough to dense area, and then we kind of send that value to the shader and do the interference. But it's kind of slow. So sign distance fields, they are 3D textures which are storing distances to a nearest surface. So in a nutshell, it allows us to figure out if you are close enough to, or close to the dense area, the danger area, and we know it for cheap. And if we have this value, we can also drive lightning. But how we do distance in something that's a volume? So in Houdini, we can take the gas cloud data again. We can kind of mark these dense areas. So let's just say if density is 0.9 and higher, we turn these areas into a mesh. Then we made a tool that is turning a mesh into the sign distance field. So it's kind of iterating through each pixel of that volume, and it's kind of asking, oh, how far I am from the mesh that we've made. Then all that is stored into a texture, and we can reuse it in the engine and drive that interference that you've seen. But we had all these kind of dynamic types of effects. There was also a need for art and design to be able to control and trigger set-piece events. So we still needed controlled, story-driven events. For example, you're flying through the gas cloud, suddenly there's lightning striking down a rock. So for that, we again used Houdini. Here we can see how a rock destruction is being made. So first, we take the rock asset. We are defining areas in which rock will be split into pieces. Then we can use physics forces to animate that destruction. If we are happy with the result, then it's just a matter of UV mapping. And Houdini is really good at it, because we can quickly and easily UV unwrap like 50 pieces or so that we have in here. Then we can just export all of that back to the engine, and it just works. So heading back to Mike.
I'm back again. OK, so I'm going to talk about lightning, which is one of my favorite subjects. So yeah, lightning, it's a key visual requirement of gas clouds, both for art and design. So yeah, basically, previously we were able to create really nice lightning effects But we didn't really have a lot of control over them. We could basically place them, and that was pretty much it. Leave them to it. They were also really expensive to use. So from the point of view of needing control, we developed several new options to allow us to do so, including the ability to have Lightning automatically position itself along the cloud surface. So that's using the sign distance field, which Michal talked about just then. But we also brought in a new setting called conductivity, and this is something that we apply to surfaces. So all surface types can have a conductivity setting now. A high conductivity setting means that there's a great chance of it being struck by lightning. So if you had two surfaces together, one with the 0 setting, one with maximum, the one with 0, if you're standing there, you're going to be safe. So with this in mind, we think that this is going to be a really powerful tool for design. We think that there's going to be lots of cool tactical implications for that, and we're really excited to see what they're going to be able to do with it. So the cost, as I say, previously, even though we could do really nice looking lightning, it was really, really expensive. And that's really a problem for something such as the gas cloud, where we want everything else to be as cheap as possible. So with the previous system, if we were going to draw something like this, we're going to be using a lot of control points. Now, the thing about control points is they're very expensive. So you'd probably, wherever this thing is going, it's basically been driven by the control points. So to kind of create that very detailed shape, you're looking at a lot of control points, and we needed to get that number right down. So this would be, what we did to solve that was basically push the rendering of the bolt onto the GPU, and we actually used GPU particles for this. What that allowed to do was use a much smaller amount of control points. So this is a fairly crude screenshot, apologies for that, but you can see the red dots are basically the control points, and we're going to use the GPU particles to actually draw that kind of detail in between them. We're basically joining the dots. So to do that, as I say, using GPU particles, we actually created a new type of particle emitter, which is a spline-guided one. So this is an example of spline-guided particle emitter. You can see on the bottom, I've got some text showing what we're actually doing. This is just going to loop, so bear with me. But yeah, rather than just have a single beam from 2 points, we wanted it to be a bit more interesting visually. So we got some various noise options. We're using simplex noise in this example, but we also had value noise as well. The way I think of it is it basically makes a straight line wibbly wobbly. I'm not the most technical out of this panel, so and we've also got shuffle noise on pulse, which allows the noise to kind of reset itself based on the random timer that we can add via the particle system. And then we've got a second octave, which just allows an extra level of detail, which is obviously really important for something like lighting in the gas cloud, where we need it to look really, really nice from far away, and we also need it to look super detailed when we get up close to it as well. So another cool thing about actually doing this on the GPU particle system is it's so easy to dynamically edit the settings. This is just an example of me playing around with a few attributes in the particle effect itself to really quickly and easily change the appearance of the lightning when required. So this is going to be a really powerful tool for the artists and design as well. That looks a little bit weird, that one, but this is just showing that you can do lots of cool things with it, basically. You know, you're just limited by your imagination. Okay, so as well as lightning, we also enable contrails and turbulence inside the gas cloud. These are the same effects that you'll have seen already when we brought in the dynamic, when we brought in atmospheric flight, but they're useful in gas clouds. They're being controlled by the density of the gas cloud now, and I think personally it's a really useful thing for multiplayer, so you can see where your co-pilots are your other players are going, useful for seeing where the enemy are and things like that. I think Ali's going to now do a recap of everything that we've got so far.
So bringing it all together, we've talked about the volumetric data set we're generating and offline tools you normally use for films, and how we crunch that down into the smallest possible amount of data for the engine. Ben talked us through how we do the ray tracing and the real-time lighting and the Fourier 2D shadow approach. Then we have these field-driven particle effects, which are driven by the SDF and the vector fields, the EM interference, nice gameplay feature, and the contrails, the lightning, which is a really key component to this, destructible rocks and assets, and then set-piece events for the more type of structured elements. And then bringing it all together, I'll show you now the fly-through of our prototype. So just a 3-minute fly-through in engine, just directly on screen, so you can see what you think. Hopefully, you'll enjoy it. Yeah, I hope you liked it. It's a lot of work that's went into that. A lot of different people have had their hands on that, and it's nice to finally share it with you. It's been like a few months in the making. Like I said, that was in-game. We recorded it last week for you. There's a bit more to do on it, so I'll go through what we need to finish off and what else we want to add to this. So everything we talked about today, like I said, it's in engine, but we just need to polish a few things. So it's not quite ready for showtime, but it's pretty close. The memory and performance is one of the main things. That was running live, recorded live, but we need to do a bit more work to get the performance down for the lower spec machines to make sure everyone can enjoy this. We need a few more shadow things to be done, so the opaque objects, the asteroids there, weren't receiving shadows from the gas cloud. It type of makes them look a bit stuck on, so that's something we're in the process of doing. It should be done soon. A lot of the VFX was placed manually in that scene, but now that we've got this SDF tech in, we're hoping to build a procedural tool to help place all this VFX. It took us a while to learn how to make something like this look good, and now that we know, now we can write a tool to help us make it very quickly so the designers don't have to spend quite so long coming back to the art team to build these things. A few changes to the workflow as well. It's all very new. Nobody's made stuff like this before in our company, so we're going to have to just spend a little bit of time figuring out how to do this quicker so we can churn them out a bit faster. And then the procedurally generated volumes is something we also want to explore. So I mentioned planetary rings at the start of the presentation. That's something we definitely want to do. That will need to be procedural because of the scale of them. There's no possible way you could build that uniquely over the size of a planet. And then we're thinking there might be other uses, like gas giants might be one. The surface of a gas giant could be made using exactly the same tech. And there's obviously plenty of other uses. We could have like the trail of a comet and other things like this. So yeah, so hope you liked it, and that's the presentation over.